The children of 19th century Alpine villages knew something modern families have forgotten. They knew that Christmas darkness held far more terrors than just Krampus with his chains and switches. While we tell cozy stories of Santa Claus and his reindeer, there are ancient demons stalking through European winter nights that make Krampus look like a friendly uncle. In the frozen valleys of Iceland, mothers still whisper about Gryla, who descends from her mountain cave with a sack large enough to carry dozens of children back to her massive cooking pot. German families once barricaded their doors against Frau Perchta, whose silver knife could slice through a child's belly in one swift motion before she stuffed it with pebbles and straw. These are not fairy tales or cautionary stories, but genuine cultural terrors that shaped centuries of Christmas traditions. Tonight we venture into the darkest corners of winter folklore, where demons far more horrifying than Krampus have terrorized generations. These are the Christmas monsters that history tried to forget, but which still lurk in the shadows of our most sacred holiday. If you're ready to look beyond the veil of forgotten myths and uncover the secrets the world chose to forget, subscribe to Inside Strange Times, so you won't miss new journeys into the realm of ancient mysteries. The screams echoed through the Icelandic valley on Christmas Eve 1843, when farmer Magnus Thorson watched something massive moving through the blizzard toward his isolated farmstead. What emerged from the white curtain of snow stood over 20 feet tall, with matted black hair hanging like wet rope and eyes that glowed red in the darkness. This was Gryla, and she had come for his children. For over 700 years, Icelandic families have lived in genuine terror of this ancient ogress who makes Krampus look like a mere prankster. Unlike the chain-rattling goat demon who merely threatens and punishes, Gryla actually devours the children she captures. The 13th century Prose Edda describes her with 15 tails, and each tail containing 100 bags that could hold 20 children each. Her husband Lepaludi stays in their mountain cave, tending to their 13 sons, known as the Yule Lads, while she hunts through villages during the darkest nights of December. What makes Gryla particularly terrifying is her ability to sense misbehaving children from miles away through the winter storms. She doesn't need a list like Santa Claus, because she can smell disobedience and taste fear on the wind. The old stories say she moves through blizzards completely unaffected by cold or snow, and her massive form can cross entire valleys in just 3 steps. When she finds a house with naughty children, she extends her long arms down chimneys or through windows, and her fingers can stretch like tentacles to reach into every corner. The Thorson incident became legendary in Iceland, not because it was unique, but because Magnus actually survived to describe what he witnessed. He wrote in his journal that Gryla's face was covered in warts the size of fists, and her mouth opened wide enough to swallow a full-grown sheep. She carried a massive sack made from human skin that writhed and bulged with movement, and he could hear muffled crying from within. Magnus had hidden his 3 children in the root cellar and covered the entrance with hay, but Gryla stood outside his house for hours, sniffing at the walls and scratching at the doors with nails like iron spikes. The historical records from medieval Iceland contain dozens of accounts of entire villages losing their children to Gryla during particularly harsh winters. The Skalholt Annals from 1495 describe a Christmas season where 37 children vanished from farms across the Westfjords, and their bones were later found scattered around a mountain cave. Parents would desperately try to appease her by leaving out bowls of meat and blood, but she only wanted living children who had misbehaved during the year. Even more disturbing are the stories of children who were taken but somehow escaped and returned to tell what they had seen. A girl named Kristen Johnsdottir claimed in 1621 that she was carried to Gryla's cave, where she saw the Ogress's massive cauldron filled with boiling water and floating pieces of small clothing. She described how Gryla would sort the children's he had captured into different piles based on their transgressions, and the worst behaved were thrown into the pot immediately, while others were kept alive in cages made of ice. Kristen said she escaped when one of the Yule lads accidentally left a door open, but no one believed her story until 3 other children from her village never returned home that Christmas. The Catholic Church tried desperately to suppress Gryla worship and stories during their occupation of Iceland, but found that fear of her was too deeply embedded in the culture. Priests would bless houses and hang crosses, but families still reported seeing her massive footprints in the snow around their farms. In 1603, the Danish government actually passed a law forbidding parents from using Gryla stories to frighten children, because so many were having psychological breakdowns. Yet the stories persisted and evolved, becoming even more grotesque as they passed through generations. Modern Icelanders still reference Gryla, though most treat her as folklore rather than genuine threat. However, there are remote farming communities in the highlands where people still perform protective rituals on December nights. They burn specific herbs and leave offerings of food at crossroads to keep her away from their homes. In 2008, a series of child disappearances near Akureyri during a December blizzard sparked genuine panic, and several families admitted they had considered the possibility of Gryla's involvement before the children were found sheltering in an abandoned barn. What makes Gryla fundamentally more terrifying than Krampus is that she represents absolute consumption rather than punishment. Krampus might beat children with birch branches or carry them to hell, but there's always the implication they might learn their lesson and return. Gryla offers no redemption or second chances because misbehaving children are simply food to sustain her through the winter. She doesn't care about teaching morality or enforcing social order, but sees human young as nothing more than meat for her pot. The transition from Gryla's mountain caves to the snow-covered forests of Central Europe brings us to an even more insidious Christmas demon whose methods are far more personal and grotesque. While Gryla hunts children as prey, Frau Perchta performs surgical horrors that would make modern serial killers seem merciful. Her story begins in the Alpine regions of Germany and Austria, where her name was whispered in terror for over 1,000 years. The first documented encounter with Frau Perchta comes from a Bavarian chronicle dated January 6, 1364. A family of wool spinners had failed to complete their yearly quota before Twelfth Night, and they woke to find their youngest daughter Maria disemboweled on the kitchen table. Her belly had been sliced open with surgical precision, and her intestines replaced with straw and pebbles and sewn back with rough black thread. The local priest recorded that the cut was so clean it could only have been made by an impossibly sharp blade, and the stitching followed a pattern unknown to any seamstress in the region. Frau Perchta, whose name means the Bright One, appears as either a beautiful white-robed woman or a haggard crone with a beak-like nose made of iron. Unlike other Christmas demons who arrive on specific nights, she stalks the 12 days between Christmas and Epiphany, checking whether families have completed their spinning and weaving work. But her real obsession focuses on children who have been lazy or disobedient during the year, and adults who have eaten something other than fish and gruel on her feast day. The descriptions of her punishments are uniquely horrifying, even by medieval standards. She doesn't simply kill her victims, but performs elaborate mutilations that seem designed to transform the human body into something else. A document from Nuremberg in 1491 describes finding a family of 5 with their stomachs opened and filled with garbage and rocks, then sewn shut with their own hair. They were still alive when discovered, but died within hours, unable to speak about what they had experienced. Jacob Grimm himself collected stories about Frau Perchta in the 1800s and noted that she seemed to represent something far older than Christianity. He theorized she was originally a pagan goddess of spinning and weaving who had been transformed into a demon by the church. But the church's own records suggest they were just as terrified of her as the common people. A bishop in Salzburg wrote in 1512 that no amount of blessing or exorcism could prevent her annual visits, and that she seemed to exist outside the normal realm of demonic entities they understood. The midnight visitations of Frau Perchta followed specific patterns that survivors occasionally documented. She would enter houses through any opening, no matter how small, and witnesses described seeing her body contort and compress in impossible ways. A baker in Munich claimed in 1635 that he watched her pour herself through a keyhole like water, then reform on the other side. She carried a long knife that appeared to be made from a single piece of ice or crystal that never melted and could cut through bone as easily as butter. What made encounters with Frau Perchta particularly traumatic was her tendency to leave survivors who had witnessed her work. These witnesses would be paralyzed but fully conscious as she performed her grotesque surgeries on family members. A documented case from Innsbruck in 1589 describes a father who watched Frau Perchta stuff his son's belly with sawdust and old shoes while being unable to move or scream. He was found the next morning still frozen in place and never spoke again, though he lived for 20 more years. The specific rules governing Frau Perchta's visits created elaborate defensive rituals in alpine communities. Families would leave a special porridge made from exactly 12 grains on their doorstep and ensure every piece of flax was properly spun before December 25th. They would mark their doors with specific symbols and burn juniper branches to mask the scent of any forbidden foods. But even perfect adherence to these rules didn't guarantee safety, because Frau Perchta could always find some minor transgression to justify her surgical interventions. In 1822, a professor at the University of Vienna named Wilhelm Mannhardt began collecting contemporary Perchta encounters and found they were still surprisingly common. Rural families reported finding livestock with their stomachs opened and filled with stones, and children waking with mysterious scars across their abdomens. One particularly disturbing case involved a girl in Tyrol who claimed Frau Perchta had opened her stomach and shown her what was inside before sewing it back without leaving a mark. The girl described her own organs in detail that no child should have known and suffered nightmares for the rest of her life. The Industrial Revolution seemed to weaken Frau Perchta's presence as traditional spinning and weaving became less common. But reports continued from isolated mountain communities where the old ways persisted. During World War II, several German soldiers stationed in remote alpine posts reported encounters with a white figure carrying a knife who would appear during blizzards. One soldier's journal found after the war described watching this figure enter their bunker and examine each sleeping man before disappearing without explanation. Modern psychologists have attempted to explain the Frau Perchta phenomenon as mass hysteria or sleep paralysis combined with cultural expectations. But this doesn't account for the physical evidence that often accompanied her visits. The surgical precision of the wounds and the specific materials used for stuffing bodies followed patterns too consistent to be random. Even today, police in Bavaria occasionally encounter crime scenes that match historical Perchta attacks, though they're classified as unsolved homicides rather than supernatural events. The distinction between Frau Perchta and other Christmas demons lies in her methodical and intimate approach to punishment. While Gryla consumes and Krampus beats, Perchta transforms her victims into grotesque art pieces. She doesn't just punish transgression, but seems to be making a statement about the human body itself and its capacity to be violated and reconstructed. The terror she inspired came not just from death, but from the possibility of becoming something inhuman while still alive. Moving from the surgical precision of Frau Perchta to the raw physical violence of our next demon requires understanding a different kind of Christmas terror. In the Pennsylvania Dutch communities of colonial America, a figure emerged that combined old-world Germanic traditions with the harsh realities of frontier life. This was Belsnickel, and unlike his European cousins, he didn't just visit for one night but stalked communities throughout the entire Christmas season. The earliest American record of Belsnickel comes from 1748 in a settlement near present-day Reading, Pennsylvania. A Lutheran minister named Friedrich Muhlenberg wrote about a ragged figure in filthy furs who appeared at isolated farmhouses, demanding to examine children. Unlike the clean-cut image of Santa Claus that would later develop, Belsnickel was described as wearing tattered animal pelts caked with mud and blood. His face was covered in soot and his beard was matted with ice and debris. He carried a switch made from black thorns and a bag that seemed to writhe with its own life. What set Belsnickel apart from other Christmas visitors was his unpredictability and violence. He would burst through doors without warning and force children to perform songs or prayers while he struck them with his switch. Those who failed his tests would be beaten severely, and several historical accounts describe children being permanently injured by his visits. A document from Lancaster County in 1761 mentions a boy whose back was so badly scarred by Belsnickel's thorns that he couldn't work in the fields for the rest of his life. The German immigrants who brought Belsnickel to America seem to have transformed him into something darker than his European origins. In the isolation of frontier settlements, where help was days away and winter meant potential death, Belsnickel became a manifestation of very real fears. He represented the wild man who had abandoned civilization and returned as something neither fully human nor animal. Parents would use threats of his coming to control children, but also genuinely feared his arrival themselves. The transformation of Belsnickel in America reached its horrifying peak during the winter of 1812 in a German settlement near Berks County, Pennsylvania. That December, 7 children vanished over 3 weeks, and their bodies were found arranged in a circle in the forest, with thorn branches woven through their clothes. Witnesses claimed to have seen Belsnickel leading the children away, but described him as standing over 7 feet tall, with antlers growing from his skull and fingers that had grown into wooden claws. The local sheriff's report stated the children appeared to have been kept alive for days and forced to participate in some kind of ritual before their deaths. What made American Belsnickel particularly terrifying was how he adapted to the New World's darkness. He would appear at barn raisings and community gatherings disguised as a traveling tradesman, then reveal himself by throwing off his coat to show his filthy furs underneath. Children would scatter in genuine terror while adults tried to maintain composure, but historical accounts show even grown men feared his presence. A blacksmith in 1829 wrote about watching Belsnickel lift a fully grown pig with one hand and bite through its neck like an apple. The Pennsylvania Dutch communities developed elaborate protocols for dealing with Belsnickel visits that went far beyond simple tradition. Families would nail iron horseshoes above every entrance and spread salt mixed with crushed sage across their thresholds. They would leave offerings of raw meat and corn whiskey at crossroads, hoping to satisfy him before he reached their homes. But Belsnickel seemed to grow stronger and more aggressive with each passing year, as if feeding on the fear he generated. In 1867, a photographer named James Patterson claimed to have captured an image of Belsnickel during a Christmas Eve visitation in Lebanon County. The photograph, which still exists in the Pennsylvania Historical Society archives, shows a dark blur near a farmhouse door with what appears to be an impossibly tall figure covered in fur. Patterson wrote that immediately after taking the photograph, his camera exploded and embedded glass shards in his face, leaving him partially blind. He spent his remaining years warning people that Belsnickel was not merely folklore, but something that should never be photographed or directly observed. The most disturbing aspect of Belsnickel encounters was his ability to mimic human voices and call children by name. Survivors described hearing their deceased relatives calling to them from outside their windows on winter nights, only to see Belsnickel's face pressed against the glass. A girl named Emma Zimmerman testified in 1873 that Belsnickel had visited her bedroom, speaking in her dead mother's voice, and tried to convince her to follow him into the forest. She only survived because her father had secretly nailed her windows shut after other children in their community had disappeared. Even into the 20th century, rural Pennsylvania communities reported Belsnickel encounters, though they became less frequent and more secretive. During the Great Depression, several homeless children vanished from around. Reading and witnesses claimed to have seen a figure in furs, leading them away with promises of food. The police investigated but found only abandoned camps in the woods, filled with animal bones and children's clothing arranged in ritualistic patterns. The case remains officially unsolved, but local historians have connected it to historical Belsnickel incidents. The terror of Belsnickel lay not just in his violence, but in his corruption of the Christmas visitor tradition. He represented the dark possibility that something pretending to be a gift bringer could actually be a predator. Unlike European demons who followed specific rules and dates, Belsnickel could appear any time during winter, and his motivations seemed to evolve beyond simple punishment into something more sadistic and personal. He didn't just hurt bad children, but seemed to enjoy the act of terrorizing entire communities and breaking down the barriers between civilization and wilderness. But even Belsnickel's frontier brutality pales before the ancient horror that still stalks the Welsh countryside each winter. For over 1,000 years, the Mari Lwyd has been scratching at doors and demanding entry in a voice that should not exist. This is not merely a demon, but the skeleton of a horse draped in white sheets that walks upright and speaks in rhyming verses, while its skull jaw clacks in rhythm. Those who have encountered the true Mari Lwyd, rather than the sanitized modern folk tradition, describe an experience that fundamentally breaks their understanding of reality. The first written account of Mari Lwyd comes from a Welsh monk in 1179, who described villages in Glamorgan being visited by a dead mare that walks as a man and speaks with the tongue of poets. He wrote that the creature would appear at the darkest point of winter, demanding entry through a ritual called ponico, where it would engage in a rhyming battle with the household. If the family failed to match its verses, the Mari Lwyd would enter, and terrible things would follow, though the monk refused to describe what he had personally witnessed. What makes Mari Lwyd uniquely disturbing among Christmas demons is that it shouldn't be able to exist at all. This is explicitly a dead animal's skeleton reanimated and given intelligence and voice. Witnesses throughout history have described the same impossible details, like seeing through its ribcage to watch its non-existent organs moving or hearing multiple voices speaking from its throat simultaneously. A Victorian antiquarian named William Roberts wrote in 1856 that he watched Mari Lwyd's jaw unhinge completely to reveal rows of human teeth growing from the bone before it began to sing. The Welsh mining communities of the 1800s treated Mari Lwyd with deadly seriousness that went far beyond cultural tradition. Miners would refuse to work during the nights it was known to walk, and families would huddle together practicing their verses in preparation for its challenge. The consequences of failing the Ponco were never explicitly stated in public records, but private journals describe finding families with their faces frozen in expressions of absolute terror and their hair turned completely white. Some households would simply be found empty, with doors hanging open and meals still warm on the table. In 1892, a group of English researchers attempted to document Mari Lwyd scientifically and followed reports of its appearance to a village near Pontypridd. Their expedition journal describes encountering something that matched the folklore descriptions but moved with an intelligence that seemed ancient and malevolent. The lead researcher, Charles Whitmore, wrote that the creature knew things about each team member that no one else could know and spoke in the voices of their dead relatives. 2 members of the expedition suffered complete psychological breakdowns and spent their remaining years in asylums, drawing pictures of horse skulls with human eyes. The rhyming battle with Mari Lwyd was never just a game, but a desperate negotiation with something that existed outside normal reality. The verses had to follow specific patterns that seemed designed to bind the creature within linguistic rules. Families would prepare for weeks, memorizing protective rhymes passed down through generations because a single mistake in meter or pronunciation could break the verbal contract. A Welsh historian in 1923 documented over 40 traditional defensive verses specifically designed to counter Mari Lwyd's challenges, but noted that the creature seemed to learn and adapt, requiring new verses each year. Modern Mari Lwyd celebrations have transformed the terror into tourist-friendly wassailing, but older Welsh residents still remember the real thing. In 1997, a group of university students attempted to recreate an authentic Mari Lwyd ritual using instructions from historical documents. They constructed the traditional horse skull arrangement and began the Ponco at midnight on December 20th. Security cameras recorded the skull moving independently and speaking in Middle Welsh, though no one present knew the language. 3 students were hospitalized with symptoms resembling severe psychological trauma, and the university banned all future folklore reconstructions. What distinguishes Mari Lwyd from other Christmas demons is its violation of the boundary between death and language. This is not a living creature that punishes or hunts, but a dead thing that has been given voice and demands interaction through poetry. The horror lies not just in its appearance, but in being forced to engage with it intellectually while knowing you're speaking to something that should be silent bone. Welsh families describe the experience as feeling their own words, being pulled from their throats, and twisted into shapes that human mouths weren't meant to make. The progression from Mari Lwyd's undead poetry to our next demon requires understanding how Christianity's attempt to suppress pagan winter spirits sometimes created something far worse. In the Alsace region between France and Germany, there walks a Christmas demon that was once a man, and this origin makes him infinitely more terrifying than any mythological creature. Hans Trapp was a real person who lived in the 1500s, and what he became after death makes even hardened historians struggle to maintain professional objectivity. The historical Hans von Trotha was a knight who owned lands around Wissembourg in 1489. According to court records, he was excommunicated by the Catholic Church for practicing unspeakable acts, though the specific details were sealed by papal order. Local legends say he made a pact with Satan for immortality and began hunting children through the forests wearing a scarecrow disguise made from human skin. The Bishop of Strasbourg wrote that Hans Trapp had abandoned his human soul and become something that wears the shape of man but houses only appetite and malice. When Hans von Trotha died in 1503, the relief in Alsace was temporary. That same Christmas Eve, multiple villages reported seeing him walking through the streets in his scarecrow costume, dragging chains made from children's bones. But this was no ghost or spirit because he left physical evidence, including footprints in blood and claw marks on doors. A priest named Father Johannes documented finding Hans Trapp inside his church on Christmas morning 1504, dismembering the nativity figures while singing Latin hymns backwards. What makes Hans Trapp particularly horrifying is that he retained his human intelligence and memories, but used them for inhuman purposes. He would appear at windows and remind children of specific sins they had committed that no one else knew about. He could speak in perfect local dialect and knew family histories going back generations. A chronicler in 1547 wrote that Hans Trapp visited his home and described in detail how the chronicler's grandfather had murdered a rival and buried him in the garden, which was later confirmed to be true. The scarecrow appearance of Hans Trapp became more grotesque with each reported sighting. Originally described as wearing ragged clothes stuffed with straw, witnesses began reporting that the straw was actually human hair and the clothes were stitched from skin. His face was said to be a leather mask that moved like living flesh, and his eyes were black holes that reflected whatever looked into them. Children who survived encounters described seeing their own faces staring back from those voids, but twisted into expressions of agony. During the 30 Years' War, soldiers camping near Wissembourg reported numerous encounters with Hans Trapp. A Swedish captain wrote in 1632 that his men had captured what they thought was a spy in a scarecrow costume, but when they tried to remove the disguise, they found it was grafted to his body. The figure spoke in perfect Swedish despite being in Alsace and told each soldier exactly how they would die. The predictions proved accurate for 7 of the 12 men present, and the captain himself was found dead on Christmas Eve with straw stuffed in his throat. The Catholic Church made multiple attempts to exorcise Hans Trapp from the region, but each ritual seemed to make him stronger. In 1712, a team of Jesuit priests performed an elaborate banishment ceremony that required relics from 3 saints. During the ritual, witnesses reported that Hans Trapp appeared inside their protective circle and began reciting their own prayers faster than they could speak. One priest's journal describes watching Hans Trapp's scarecrow body split open to reveal hundreds of children's faces beneath the straw, all screaming silently. French Revolution documents contain a bizarre incident where revolutionary forces arrested Hans Trapp, thinking he was a royalist sympathizer in disguise. The arrest report from 1793 describes a figure in ancient scarecrow garments who couldn't be removed from his cell because the iron bars would bend away from him. Guards reported that he would stand motionless for days, then suddenly be found in different positions without anyone seeing him move. After 2 weeks, they simply abandoned the prison, and when they returned, the entire building had been filled with straw arranged in human shapes. Modern encounters with Hans Trapp continue in rural Alsace, though they're often dismissed as folklore or misidentification. In 2003, a family near Wissembourg reported finding scarecrow figures arranged around their house each morning of December. Security footage showed the figures appearing between video frames with no visible person placing them. On Christmas Eve, their youngest child was found in the garden, speaking Middle High German, which she didn't know, and describing things she called the inside of the scarecrow. The family moved immediately and refused to discuss what else they experienced. The terror of Hans Trapp transcends typical demon folklore because he represents the corruption of human will beyond death. He chose to become what he is and continues choosing to hunt and terrorize with full awareness of his actions. Unlike demons born from myth or necessity, Hans Trapp was a man who deliberately transformed himself into something that could persist beyond mortality. His intelligence makes him unpredictable, and his human origins make him understand exactly what fears to exploit. But even Hans Trapp's calculated evil cannot match the cosmic wrongness of our final Christmas demon. In the mountains of Greece and the Balkans, there exists something so fundamentally disturbing that even hardened folklorists struggle to categorize it. The Kallikantzaroi are not individual demons, but a collective entity that emerges during the 12 days of Christmas when reality itself becomes unstable. These are creatures that exist in the spaces between moments and feed on the dissolution of natural law. Ancient Greek texts describe the Kallikantzaroi as things that live underground, spending the entire year sawing at the world tree that holds reality together. When Christmas arrives and the sun stops moving during winter solstice, they abandon their work and swarm to the surface. But these are not creatures in any sense we understand, because witnesses describe them as being simultaneously multiple sizes and shapes. A single Kallikantzaroi can be both 3 inches tall and 12 feet high at the same moment, depending on the angle of observation. A Byzantine scholar in 900 CE wrote the most detailed early account of Kallikantzaroi behavior. He described them entering homes, not through doors or windows, but through the gaps between seconds. Families would be sitting at dinner and suddenly realize the Kallikantzaroi had always been there, watching from corners that didn't exist until observed. They would eat food by making it never have existed, and speak by removing words from conversations that had already happened. The scholar wrote that after his own encounter, he could no longer remember his mother's name because a Kallikantzaroi had eaten it from history. The appearance of Kallikantzaroi defies consistent description because they seem to exist partially outside three-dimensional space. Witnesses describe seeing creatures made of hair and teeth arranged in patterns that hurt to perceive. Others report beings that look like inside-out animals with their organs forming external shells. A Greek Orthodox priest in 1341 wrote that he saw a Kallikantzaroi that was simultaneously a newborn baby and an ancient corpse occupying the same location without being either. He spent his remaining years drawing diagrams trying to explain what he had seen, but the drawings would change when no one was looking. What makes the Kallikantzaroi fundamentally different from every other Christmas demon is their effect on causality itself. Houses they visit experience temporal anomalies, where rooms age decades in minutes, or family members briefly exist at multiple ages simultaneously. A documented case from Macedonia in 1867 describes a household where the Kallikantzaroi caused Tuesday to happen before Monday, and the family could remember both sequences of events being equally real. Several members suffered permanent psychological damage from trying to reconcile contradictory memories of the same events. The traditional defenses against Kallikantzaroi reveal how deeply they violate normal reality. Greeks would burn old shoes because the smell somehow prevented the creatures from fully manifesting in linear time. Families would leave colanders on their doorsteps, believing the Kallikantzaroi would become trapped, trying to count holes that didn't maintain consistent numbers. A blacksmith in Thessaloniki in 1792 created an iron cross that existed in 7 dimensions simultaneously and claimed it could wound them. His notes on its construction were found to contain mathematical equations that wouldn't be formally discovered by human mathematicians until the 20th century. During World War II, a British intelligence officer stationed in Greece filed a report about encountering what locals called Kallikantzaroi in December 1943. He described watching his tent suddenly contain more space inside than outside, and finding his equipment age to rust while his photographs showed events that hadn't happened yet. Most disturbing was his claim that he could see his fellow soldiers existing as probability clouds rather than solid beings. The report was classified, and the officer spent the rest of his life in psychiatric care, drawing pictures of shapes that witnesses said would give them severe headaches. Modern physicists who have studied Kallikantzaroi accounts suggest they might represent some kind of dimensional intrusion during periods when Earth's position creates specific gravitational conditions. The 12 days of Christmas coincide with subtle astronomical alignments that could theoretically weaken barriers between parallel realities. But this scientific speculation doesn't explain the consistent reports of malevolent intelligence or the way encounters seem designed to cause maximum psychological trauma. The Kallikantzaroi don't just exist wrongly, but seem to enjoy demonstrating how fragile human perception of reality actually is. The progression from Krampus to these ultimate Christmas demons reveals a truth our ancestors understood, but we've forgotten in our sanitized modern celebrations. The winter solstice represents more than just the longest night, because it's a time when the boundaries that normally protect us grow thin. Each of these entities, from Gryla's cannibalistic hunger to the Kallikantzaroi's reality-breaking presence, embodies specific fears about what might enter our world when darkness reaches its peak. We tell ourselves these are just stories and folklore born from primitive minds trying to explain winter's hardships. But the consistency of encounters across centuries and cultures suggests something more disturbing. Perhaps these demons don't represent external threats, but glimpses of what humanity could become if we abandon the social contracts and moral boundaries that define us. Or perhaps they're reminders that our cozy Christmas celebrations exist as desperate attempts to create light and warmth against forces that have always waited in the December darkness. The children who once huddled in terror on Christmas Eve knew something we've chosen to forget. They understood that celebration and horror are separated by the thinnest of veils, and that singing carols and lighting candles were never just traditions, but protective rituals. When we gather with family around decorated trees and exchange gifts, we're not just celebrating, but collectively agreeing to ignore the scratching at our windows and the footsteps in the snow that lead nowhere. Because acknowledging what really walks abroad on Christmas night would mean admitting that our modern world's comfort is just an illusion stretched over ancient darknesses that have never truly left. So this December, when you hear unexpected sounds outside your door or catch movement in your peripheral vision, remember that Krampus with his chains and switches is the tamest of winter's visitors. The real Christmas demons don't want to punish naughty children, but to remind us that the distinction between human and monster is far more fragile than we dare admit. And in those long, dark hours before dawn on Christmas morning, when even the bravest adults pull their blankets tighter, perhaps it's not childish superstition, but ancestral wisdom warning us that some traditions of protection should never be abandoned.